All right, so welcome back. This is our second part of the Strong Do What They Can, the Weak Suffer What They Must. Now that we've covered the theory, now we're going to look at an application. So how might we see this concept in social 10? Well, we could present it, and we have in the past, presented it as a source that we'd like you to analyze and that we'd like you to respond to. So in lesson 7, towards the end, we have a sample rough draft of some planning of an essay. So we're going to look at it together so that you can get better at A2, the essay writing. The first step is analysis of the source, which is very similar to A1. So we're going to look at the analysis of the source together now. And I will remind you that on Monday, which is our next day together because there's no class tomorrow, on Monday you will have a source to analyze as an evaluation for this ancient globalization unit. So I thought we should do some analysis together today to get you more prepped for Monday as well. So when you read a source, read it together just once, holistically, big picture, read it all. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Then you go back and, if you had this on a piece of paper, then we want you to write all over it. Splash down all over that paper ideas. So when I read through it and I read the strong, I pause right there. I'm like, okay, wait a minute. When you say the strong, what do you mean? The critical analytical part of my brain, when I read this quote and it says the strong, I pause on the word strong and I'm like, let's clarify. What does it mean to be strong? Are we talking about military strength? Are we talking about economic strength? Because there are some nations in 2020 that have economic power that don't have as much military power. Or we have nations like North Korea that at least on paper have military power, but economically North Korea is quite weak. So when they say the strong, is that a military strong? Is that an economic strong? Is that a political strong or a social strong? How do we define and measure strength? Is my first thing that I think of when I read that. And are we talking about a macro measurement of strength? So is this strong at a national level? Or are we talking about micro level of strength? Is this strong at an individual level? Are we talking about transnationals? Are we talking about corporations? Not national players, not governments, but subnational players. So who's the strong that you talk about? So one of the skills that you need in social studies is to develop the critical analytical part of your brain. And you break language down. So you see a word like the strong and you're like, oh, time out. What do you mean by strong? Strong do what they can. Pause. What do we mean, what do they can? Does that mean murder? Does it mean genocide? Does that mean to enslave? Is there a limit to what they can? Because what they can seems to be an absolute statement. What might be some examples of what the strong can? Strong do what they can. So they can do it, right? So if they can physically do it, they're allowed to do it. The strong do what they can. The weak, again, how do we define weak? Suffer what they must. And then you might talk about what does suffering mean? What does it mean that they must do it? So that's some of my thinking that I would do, the brainstorming, before I'd get into the planning of my analysis paragraph. I'd look at the big rocks of the language and break the language down. You need to do that on essays, and you need to do that on S1s or assignment 1s as well. So key to success in writing, which is half of your mark in this class, is breaking the language down and being critical and analytical about it. What does the strong mean? Is that a religious word? Is it that you're the chosen ones? What does it mean? Does it mean different things to different people? Who defines what it means to be strong? So lots of nuances, lots of layers to that word, the strong. So, moving on, we can look at the analysis of the source. So when we analyze the source, it's good to talk about things like, big picture, what's the theme here, connected to globalization in grade 10, to nationalism in grade 11, to ideologies and liberalism in grade 12. You want to, if you can, connect it to nature of mankind, connected to the purpose of life, connected to philosophy, connected to other of the social sciences like economics and politics and sociology and psychology. So this is what we ended up coming up with. The world is not an equal place, nor is history a story that celebrates, no, I'm going to mispronounce a lot of words here, mediocrity. Many have contemplated to what extent is it natural or even justified for the strong to feed on the weak. Although the source, and see how in the analysis I quote the source directly. I'm like, although the source, I speak to the source. We need to speak to the source in A1 and A2 writings. You know, we should be able to do a Control F. Control F is just find. So when you submit your stuff in Google Classroom, I should do a Control F for the phrase the source. I should be able to find that. I should be able to find ideological perspective. I should be able to find the source, because these are the steps of breaking the language down. Although the source is a quote accredited to an ultimatum. So what this sentence is doing is establishing the history behind the source. It's giving me some background, right? Although the source is a quote accredited to an ultimatum sent from the mighty Athenians to intimidate the vulnerable and neutral Molossians, and I'm pretty sure I misspelled that. During the Peloponnesian Wars, the continued significance of this concept can be discovered when one looks at the plethora of death and destruction that has been committed by those following this social Darwinistic logic. So, what have we done there? We've established the background, but we've also talked about the continued significance. So these are boxes to check in our writing. As we're breaking down the source, we're saying this is where it came from, but this is why we should still care about it today. So it came from the Peloponnesian War. That seems like 2,400 years ago. I shouldn't care about that anymore. So then we also want to establish, hey, wait a minute, this is still important today. So we also have the continued significance of this concept can be discovered when one looks at the plethora of death and destruction that's been committed by those following this social Darwinistic. You could have put this realist, this survival of the fittest, any of that language we used in that last lesson, right? Logic. This issue is complicated. So we want to talk about, the complexity of the source, the division of society, right? The idea that not everybody agrees with one ideological perspective here. So this issue is complicated as we explore the language used in defense of the strong. Firstly, we need to establish what does it mean to be strong. This term, depending upon which era of history, may refer to one's military might, strength of your economy, connection to God, attractiveness of your ideology, or even individual characteristics like charisma or genetics. Naturally, as we define the weak, we tend to discover groups of people lacking the qualities accredited above to the strong. So what we've done there is we've taken what we call the big rocks, the main phrases, terms of the source, and said, you know what, this is what it means. This is the significance of the language. This is the complexity of the language. This is how the language creates a conversation that exposes a division of society because people have different values and assumptions. You need to do this in your intros. That's why we're practicing it, because you're probably sitting there saying, I've never done anything like that before. That's why we're showing you examples, right? These are examples, so that you'll be able to do this in the near future. Put simply, the strong are the haves, and the weak are the have-nots. The source suggests that those characterized as the strong do what they can. So I'm pulling that phrase, right? Do what they can. I pull it straight out of the quote. The source suggests that those characterized as strong do what they can. In history, this has meant that the strong have plundered, pillaged, raped, colonized, assimilated, and eradicated those who are the weak. So I'm breaking down the language, right? Saying this is what it means. I haven't judged it yet. I haven't jumped in with my opinion. I'm just trying to establish what the conversation's about, and then at the end of the analysis, I give my opinion. Although that list does identify types of suffering, the source also provides a reason, justification, right, for the suffering. They, the weak, must. Although the source doesn't state why the weak must suffer, we can infer. Remember in A1, we infer. What's not on the page, but we can infer that it's a value or an assumption behind the logic on the page. Although the source doesn't state why the weak must suffer, we can infer that they suffer because they are not the strong. This logic shows an application of the theory behind social Darwinism. It celebrates natural selection, the law of the jungle, the survival of the fittest, the school of realism, all of those things we talked about in our last lesson. Beyond the obvious crowd of the weak that should, but probably are unable to protest that their exploitation, many may point to the immoral consequences of the logic presented by the source. So now we're talking about the division of society and saying, you know what, the weak should say this is horrible, but also others should say this is immoral. And then there's my thesis. Now if this was actually an essay, I would have gone back and edited the language, because this is kind of a rough draft, and I wouldn't have included the term thesis there. This is a teaching device, not an actual essay. That's why it says thesis. You don't put the word thesis there. But you can certainly underline it if you want. So in our thesis, that's our response to the source. So before we respond, we break down, what are we responding to? We break down the language, we break down their ideological perspective. We talk about the significance, the complexity, the division of society, and then ultimately we come up with a response. And we want to have a response that enables us to build a body. So the response should be an argument that can be subdivided into smaller arguments that we can have paragraphs in the body. So here's our thesis. Although the strong may have the power to do what they want, and this practice may appear to be natural, so even already you can see how I got two paragraphs, right? Paragraph 1, strong may have the power. Paragraph 2, this might seem natural. I'm building myself up for a logical, organized essay. Although the strong may have the power to do what they want, and this practice may appear to be natural, it is not justifiable to feed on the weak. Relationships that result from globalization should be based on mutual benefits. And what did I also do in the end? I tied it back to globalization, because that's our course. There's my thesis. Thesis, when you look at the thesis, there's no doubt that that's a response to the source, because I'm using the language of the source. The thesis needs to be a response to a conversation initiated by the source. Then, from the thesis, as we do here, we can build a body. The body is built around the argumentation. So in the body, it is now my job to defend that. That's the purpose of my body. My purpose of my body is not to argue against it. I've been asked by some teachers in the province, how do you teach your students to build their body? Do you tell them to do one paragraph in favor of their argument and then another paragraph in favor and then one against? No. Why would you do that? If you're in an argument with your significant other, do you spend a third of your time arguing against yourself? If you're a lawyer, do you spend a third of your time presenting a case that your client's guilty? You better not. That's not your job. Your job is to defend your argument. The exploration of the division of society happens before your thesis, not after. Exploring the other side of the opinion can happen before your thesis, not after. It's more convincing before. It's not convincing after. So here's our body. Argument number 1, A1. Argument 1, A1. The strong may have the power to do what they want. So in this paragraph, we would define the strong, talk about economic power, talk about things like GDP, per capita income, talk about resources that are finite, commodities that are valuable, talk about the overlap between economic and military power, how countries that have economic power have military opportunities to build. So the United States has, a military industrial complex that no country on earth can rival because of their economy. So when we talk about economic power, we can talk about the Chinese had commodities like silk that the world desired. So we learned just yesterday with the Silk Road that the Chinese had silk, Europe didn't have silk, and China kept that idea of how to make silk a secret. So they had a monopoly on a commodity that was in demand. Because they had a monopoly on a commodity in demand, they had power. Chinese had commodities like silk that the world desired, so it was the Chinese who controlled the terms of exchange during the Silk Road with the Roman Empire. Also not needing anything from others. No, they took some stuff in exchange, like silver and cotton, but they didn't need it, or at least they didn't sell to Europeans that they really wanted that. They kept their need for European goods hidden. This ultimately will lead to the need for Europe to find a better way to get to China. It's not China that finds Europe, it's Europe that finds China, because China didn't need to leave. They had what they needed. But Europe needed to get to China so that they could continue to trade with all those things we desired the Chinese had. China had economic power, they have it today as well, by being the manufacturing hub of the world. As a result of the age of exploration during the 19th century, the British came into direct contact with the Chinese. Due to superior weapon technology, the British were able to now enforce their will on the Chinese. So this new power relationship is referred to by many as, in China, as the century of humiliation. So in the coming weeks, we're going to study history from Columbus to now. And when we study history from Columbus to now, one of the case studies we'll look at is the century of humiliation, and how through gunboat diplomacy, the British Empire were able to force their will on the Chinese. And what was their will, by the way? You will buy opium from us. You will buy our drugs so that we can make money from you. So the British Empire was just a drug dealer. Paragraph 2. This practice may appear to be natural, the strong feeding on the weak. In nature, the strong feed on the weak, so you could talk about, alphas and betas, you could talk about packs, and you could talk about apex predators, and I'm not talking about, Randy Orton. I'm talking about apex predators like polar bears and things like that. The strong feed on the weak. This has been applied to studies of mankind and has also led to the ideology of social Darwinism. So then you make the connection to social Darwinism, you talk about what that is. As a result of social Darwinism, the 19th and 20th centuries were characterized by waves of European imperialism in places like Africa. So here's your argument, here's your sub-arguments, and there's a logical flow between them. We're letting argumentation drive our paper, not evidence. Evidence is there to continue the argument, to support the argument, not to overpower the argument. If you write essays for me and it's hard to find your argumentation in your body, I'm going to say, hey, go back to the strong do what they can sample and see how you're supposed to build your essay around argumentation, not just here's everything I know about Europeans in Africa and you tell me why I put it there, because I really don't know. I really don't have a point to this paragraph. Paragraph 3, it is not justifiable to feed on the weak. Then in this paragraph, it is not justifiable to feed on the weak. If that's your argument, it's logical that, man, I should probably begin by talking about what is justifiable, what is justice, what does it mean to be moral or immoral? Illustrate the immoral actions of imperialists in a variety of case studies. And this is where you can get into the Spanish Empire and all of the genocide that they committed in Latin America. You can also obviously look at a lot of Canadian history here too. There's blood on the hands of Canadians and British and the French here as well. Paragraph 4, relationships that result from globalization should be based on mutual benefits. The British Empire collapsed in India because the Indian people could no longer see the benefits of being a part of it. So, describe how the British Empire had a negative impact on India. But following the collapse of the British Empire, India actually suffered a civil war. India is an emerging economic superpower, and the British, in light of their severing ties with the EU, could use more trading partners. Now that they've left the EU, the British need, and India is going to soon be the most populated country in the world. India is going to have power because of population. Therefore, it would have been mutually beneficial to have a relationship between India and Britain where both parties benefited and where both parties were in power. In that scenario, India and the UK could be partners today. So I would argue that at the end of the next part of our history unit, you should be able to write this essay. Strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Here's your outline. You should be able to come in on a Monday and by lunch that day be done. So this is where we're working towards. We have multiple essays we're looking at right now, multiple sources we're breaking down, concepts we need to be considering. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Lesson 7 also shows another sample. So we could have this very related. Although they may resist, it is justified to impose your will on inferior peoples. It's the same quote. It's just been rewritten, different language. So if you're going to break this down, if you're analyzing this source, key steps would be, it says, although they may resist. Why would they include they may resist? Why would they include that? What's the agenda? What's the purpose of the inclusion of that phrase? Is that meant to be there to try to convince someone in light of the idea that they know that there will be resistance? So there's an agenda behind the language. Although they may resist, there's a tone. They're trying to convince you that, you know what? The resistance is natural. They're going to try. The Molossian people may try to resist, but they'll be slaughtered. What does the term justified mean? How might one impose their will? It is justified to impose your will. What does that mean, impose your will? Why is this a significant question? So, regardless of which actual prompt you get, you go through the same steps in the analysis of the source. So on Monday, we're going to have an A1 source, but a lot of the steps are the same. And we're going to look at that after lunch. So you have 7 minutes left before lunch. I want you to go back over that essay guideline, and I want you to think about this essay that's on here too. And I need you to start planting some seeds in your writing. If you happen to be at a point where you're like, you know what, I get those two things, then I would suggest that you go to your Google Classroom and you look at the assignment that we're doing Monday, because I posted the evaluation already. Spend these next 7 minutes wisely, because after lunch, I can't guarantee we still have the Chromebooks. So spend these 7 minutes wisely.